On a frozen highway in Wyoming, a 45-year-old man in a worn leather jacket pulled into a quiet roadside diner, his German shepherd waiting outside in the snow. He ordered coffee. Nothing more. Then a waitress saw something she wasn't meant to see. Two strangers, one glass, one silent drop. As his hand reached for the drink, she leaned in and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Don't drink that. Leave now." He didn't run, he stood up. And in that moment, with his loyal dog watching from the dark, a simple act of courage set off a chain of events that would put lives in danger and expose a secret the entire town was hiding. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed hard against the small Wyoming highway town, wind dragging sheets of snow across the asphalt, while the yellow lights of a lone roadside diner struggled to stay warm against the cold. Michael Hayes eased his pickup into the parking lot after hours of driving through whiteout conditions, the engine ticking as it cooled while snow gathered on the hood. At 45, Michael carried himself with the quiet restraint of a man who had learned long ago that attention invited trouble. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face cut by sharp lines at the jaw, and cheekbones, a short, untrimmed beard dusted with gray, and eyes that had the habit of scanning a room before settling anywhere. He wore the same clothes he always did in winter, a heavy dark brown leather jacket softened by age, a red and navy flannel shirt beneath it, faded jeans rubbed pale at the knees, thick leather cold-weather boots, and a gray wool scarf wrapped close around his neck. Outside in the bed of the truck, Max shifted slightly, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a powerful frame, black and tan coat alert, amber eyes, and ears that never quite relaxed. Max was calm, but watchful, the kind of dog that didn't bark unless there was reason. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and grease mixed with the sound of an old heater rattling against the walls. Michael chose a corner booth with his back to the wall, shrugging out of his gloves and resting them beside him. He ordered black coffee and nothing else. He spoke politely, briefly, his voice low, and even the voice of someone who had spent years learning when silence was safer than explanation. He didn't notice most of the room, just habits and exits, reflections in the window glass, the rhythm of movement around him. Sarah Miller did notice him. At 28, Sarah was tall and slim, with long chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail, pale skin reddened by constant exposure to heat and cold, and tired green eyes that rarely stopped moving. She had learned to read people quickly during night shifts to sense moods before they turned sharp. She moved with efficient grace between tables, her posture slightly hunched from long hours, but her expression kind, practiced, careful. She had grown up in this town and learned early that survival meant keeping your head down and your instincts sharp. When Michael stood and walked toward the restroom, Sarah's attention drifted briefly to 2 men sitting several booths away. They were both in their 30s, clean-cut in a way that felt rehearsed, wearing dark jackets too light for the weather. One of them hadn't touched his coffee since it arrived. As soon as Michael disappeared down the narrow hallway, one man rose casually, as if stretching, and moved toward Michael's table. Sarah saw his hand slip from his pocket, something small and pale between his fingers. He leaned over the table, dropped it into the glass, and straightened again. The liquid didn't fizz. It didn't cloud, just a ripple that vanished almost instantly. Sarah froze. Her stomach tightened hard enough to make her dizzy. The man returned to his seat, and the other looked directly at her eyes, flat and measuring. He didn't smile or threaten. He simply made sure she understood she had been seen seeing. Sarah's hands trembled as she carried plates toward the kitchen, her mind racing through options. She could say nothing. She could finish her shift and go home. That would be smart. That would be safe. She had bills to pay, and no one who would protect her if things went wrong. Michael returned moments later, unaware, rolling his shoulders, as he sat, one hand already reaching for the coffee. Sarah felt her breath catch. She moved before she could talk herself out of it, stepping close with the coffee pot, leaning in as if offering a refill. Her voice came out barely above the hum of the heater. "Don't drink that. Leave now." Michael's hand stopped inches from the glass. He looked up at Sarah, really looked at her, taking in the fear she was trying and failing to hide. Then his gaze dropped to the coffee, shifted to the two men, and something in his expression changed. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. The kind that comes from seeing a familiar pattern return. He didn't run. He stood slowly, pushing the booth back with controlled ease, leaving the coffee untouched. Sarah's heart hammered as he walked directly toward the men. Max lifted his head outside, sensing the shift before anyone else did. Michael stopped at their booth, his posture relaxed but solid, like a door that wouldn't open no matter how hard you pushed. "You want to explain yourselves?" he asked, voice calm, almost conversational. One man smirked, the kind of smile meant to provoke. "Just having coffee. That a problem?" Michael said nothing, letting silence stretch until the smile faltered. Chairs scraped as the men stood, tossing bills onto the table. As they passed Sarah on the way out, one of them paused just long enough to murmur, "Careful who you help." The door swung shut behind them, cold air rushing in. Michael returned to Sarah's side. Up close, she saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the weight behind his eyes. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her legs felt weak. He thanked her, left enough cash to cover more than his bill, and wrote a number on a napkin, sliding it toward her. "If anything happens, you call." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Outside, Max jumped down as Michael climbed into the truck, snow swirling around them. Sarah watched the taillights disappear into the storm, her fingers closing around the napkin. The diner felt suddenly too quiet. She stared at the untouched coffee, wondering how close she had come to changing nothing at all, and how far she had already gone. Cold daylight settled over the Wyoming town, like a thin sheet of ice-pale sun, reflecting off snowbanks and frozen windshields, while the streets moved slowly, cautiously, as if the night had not fully let go. Michael Hayes drove out of the diner parking lot before dawn, Max steady in the bed of the pickup, snow dusting the dog's thick black and tan coat as the truck merged onto the highway. Michael's jaw stayed tight for miles, his eyes fixed ahead, the leather of his dark brown jacket creasing with every small movement of the steering wheel. He did not look back. He rarely did. Max, 4 years old and built solid with a broad chest and powerful legs, stood braced against the cold ears forward, scanning the darkness behind them until the diner lights disappeared. Michael had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself loudly. It lingered, waited, followed. That night had not been random. The men, the glass, the look they gave the waitress, it all fit a pattern he recognized too well. When he finally pulled off the highway onto a narrow county road, he stopped, climbed out, and rested a gloved hand against Max's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. "We'll stay close," he murmured, more to himself than the dog. Max flicked an ear, understanding tone, if not words. Sarah Miller woke late the next morning with a knot still lodged in her chest. She lived alone in a small second-floor apartment above a closed hardware store, the kind of place that creaked when the wind shifted. At 28, she looked younger than her years, until fear tightened her features, sharpening the lines around her eyes. Her long chestnut hair fell loose over her shoulders as she stood at the window, pale skin washed out by winter light watching the street below. Nothing looked wrong, and that made it worse. She replayed the night over and over, the way Michael's hand had frozen above the glass, the silence when he faced those men. She touched the napkin in her pocket, smoothing the creases, reading the number again, as if it might change. She told herself she was imagining things, that the warning had ended at the diner door. By midday, the sense of being watched had crept in. At the grocery store, a man lingered too long in the same aisle pretending to study canned soup. He was in his 30s, clean jacket, short hair, eyes that flicked up every time she moved. When she turned toward the checkout, he followed close enough that she could feel his presence without seeing him. Outside, another car idled across the lot longer than necessary, exhaust puffing white into the air. Sarah's pulse quickened her thoughts, tumbling between panic and denial. She had grown up here. She knew the faces. These were not them. Michael returned to town that afternoon, though no one noticed. He parked 2 blocks from the diner, engine off, watching through the windshield. His beard, rough and streaked with gray, hid the tension in his jaw, but his eyes missed little. Years ago, a winter operation had taught him the cost of trusting appearances, a night when quiet had meant survival for some, and death for others. He did not talk about that night, but it had shaped everything that came after, leaving him reserved, methodical, and slow to trust. Max lay in the truck bed, head resting on his paws, eyes tracking movement in the reflections of passing cars. When a stranger paused near Sarah's apartment building later that day, Michael saw it. The man was tall, thin hood, pulled low posture, too still. Michael did not approach. He waited. The man eventually left, glancing over his shoulder once too often. Max lifted his head, a low sound rumbling in his chest, then settled again when Michael exhaled. At the diner that evening, Sarah worked her shift with forced normalcy. Her movements were precise, her smile practiced, but inside she was unraveling. She caught fragments of conversation that felt too pointed, jokes about minding one's business, warnings disguised as humor. One customer, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat, leaned a little too close when she refilled his cup and murmured, "This town's changing. Best to keep your head down." She nodded and stepped away, hands shaking. From the corner booth near the window, Michael watched coffee untouched in front of him. He had returned quietly, his leather jacket, zipped scarf pulled high. He did not meet Sarah's eyes. He did not want to draw attention. Max remained outside, a dark shape against the snow, visible only if you knew where to look. When Sarah finished her shift, the parking lot felt exposed, the sky already darkening. She walked faster than usual, keys threaded between her fingers. She did not see Michael until he stepped from behind a parked truck, keeping a respectful distance. He looked the same as the night before, solid, guarded, tired. "You all right?" he asked softly. Sarah swallowed, nodding, though it was a lie. She wanted to ask him everything, to demand explanations, but fear tightened her throat. Michael seemed to read it anyway. "You did the right thing," he said. "Sometimes that draws attention." He glanced around, once eyes narrowing. "If it gets worse, you call." He did not wait for an answer. He walked away, Max's shadow moving with him. That night, Sarah sat on her couch long after dark, lights off, listening to the building settle. Every sound felt amplified. She held her phone thumb hovering over the number on the napkin. She wondered who Michael Hayes really was, why he moved like someone expecting trouble, why a man like that would bother watching over a waitress he barely knew. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires crunching over snow. Sarah's heart pounded, but she did not call. Not yet. Somewhere in the darkness, Michael waited, and Max stood guard, silent and patient, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Snow thickened the night, muffling the Wyoming town, until streets' roofs and parked cars seemed wrapped in cotton, the cold pressing close to the windows like a listening ear. Sarah Miller sat on the edge of her couch with the lights off her apartment reduced to shadows, and the steady tick of the wall clock. At 28, she had learned how to live quietly, but never like this. Her tall, slim frame was tense, shoulders drawn in long chestnut hair loose around her pale face, green eyes fixed on the door as if it might breathe. The day's unease had followed her home, clinging to her thoughts like frost. She replayed every look, every pause, every voice that had sounded too careful. When the footsteps came slow and deliberate on the stairs outside, her breath caught hard enough to sting. They stopped just beyond her door. Not a stumble, not a rush. Waiting. Sarah rose bare feet, cold against the floor, phone clenched so tightly her fingers ached. She listened for a knock. None came. The handle did not turn. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then the steps moved again, retreating measured, as if whoever stood there wanted her to know they could return. Sarah sank back onto the couch, shaking tears burning, but refusing to fall. She pulled the napkin from her pocket, the inked number smudged from worry, and this time she did not hesitate. Michael Hayes answered on the second ring, voice low and steady. He did not ask questions she could not answer. He told her to lock the door and stay where she was. He hung up and moved. The pickup tore through the snowstorm headlights, carving a narrow tunnel through white darkness. Michael's gloved hands firm on the wheel jaw set beneath his short, graying beard. At 45, he carried the memory of nights when delay had cost lives, when footsteps in the snow had meant something far worse. Max sensed it before the truck stopped the 4-year-old German shepherd, rising in the bed muscles coiling beneath his thick black and tan coat, ears forward, amber eyes bright. When Michael pulled up beneath Sarah's building, Max leapt down, first boots crunching behind him as Michael followed. The wind tore at Michael's dark brown leather jacket, at the gray wool scarf pulled high against his throat, but he barely felt it. He scanned the street, the parked cars, the dark windows marking angles and shadows. Nothing moved. That did not mean nothing waited. Sarah opened the door just wide enough to see them, relief crashing over her so suddenly it left her weak. Max stepped forward without command, placing himself squarely between her and the hallway, his stance calm but unyielding, tail low, head high. She had grown up around dogs, but none like this. Max did not bark or snarl. He simply occupied the space, a living barrier radiating quiet assurance. Michael followed, careful to close the door behind him, eyes still alert as he checked the lock, the windows, the corners of the small apartment. "You're safe for now," he said, voice controlled, almost gentle. Sarah nodded, hugging her arms around herself, aware of how small she must look beside him. Up close she noticed the fine scars at his knuckles, the lines carved by years of restraint rather than anger. He moved with economy, every action deliberate, as if chaos were something he refused to invite. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, Max settling at Michael's feet, but never truly resting. Sarah studied the man who had upended her life with a warning and a number. He met her gaze steadily. "What happened tonight wasn't a coincidence," Michael said. Neither was the diner. He told her the truth without drama. There were people in this town who controlled things quietly, permits, contracts, protection disguised as favors. They thrived on fear and silence. Others refused to bow. The conflict never made headlines because it did not need to. It lived in glances and threats, in accidents that were not accidents. When Sarah had spoken up, she had disrupted something carefully balanced. "They don't like witnesses," Michael said. "They like examples." Sarah's chest tightened as understanding settled. Her kindness had not been invisible. It had been a flare. She asked who he was, finally. Michael did not give titles. He said he had learned to recognize patterns, to stand between people, and the consequences of refusing to look away. He did not mention the winter years ago, when he had trusted the wrong quiet, when a single hesitation had changed the shape of his life. But the weight of it sat in his eyes. "You didn't choose this," he said. "But you're in it now." Sarah swallowed fear, mingling with a fragile thread of resolve. She had wanted to help. She had not wanted a war. Michael nodded as if hearing the thought. "Most people don't," he said. Outside, the wind howled along the street, rattling the building. Sarah thought of the man who had stood outside her door, of the patience in his steps. "Will they come back?" she asked. Michael did not soften the answer. "Probably," he said. "Not tonight." He rose, adjusting his jacket, signaling Max with a subtle movement. The dog stood immediately, pressing close to Sarah for a moment before returning to Michael's side. The contact grounded her warmth through fear. Michael wrote nothing down this time. He simply met her eyes. "You call me at the first sign," he said. "You don't second-guess it." Sarah nodded. She believed him now, not because he promised safety, but because he acknowledged danger. They left as quietly as they had arrived. From the window, Sarah watched the truck pull away, Max's silhouette steady against the snow. The apartment felt less empty, though the fear remained reshaped. She understood now that the kindness she had offered had weight, that it carried consequences she could not ignore or undo. Somewhere in the storm, Michael waited, and Max stood guard, and the town held its breath. Sarah locked the door, slid down against it, and for the first time since the diner allowed herself to cry, not in regret, but in the stark knowledge that there was no turning back. Snow hammered the windows and erased the streetlights into pale halos, turning Sarah Miller's apartment into a small island of light, floating in a white Wyoming night. Sarah sat on the couch with her coat still on tall and slim shoulders tense beneath the fabric. Chestnut hair pulled back tighter than usual, pale skin drawn thin by fear and resolve. At 28, she had never imagined agreeing to something like this, yet the plan had formed with a grim clarity that left little room for argument. Michael Hayes had explained it plainly earlier that evening, standing in her kitchen with his dark brown leather jacket dusted in snow-gray wool scarf, wrapped high voice low and steady. The men watching her were testing boundaries. They would escalate. The only way to stop being hunted was to force the hunters into the open. Sarah would appear alone, vulnerable. Michael would not be far. Max would be closer still. Sarah's hands shook as she set her phone on the table, where it could be seen the screen glowing faintly, a deliberate signal of normalcy. Fear pressed against her ribs, but beneath it lived something stubborn, a refusal to disappear quietly. Michael had prepared the apartment with quiet efficiency. He checked the locks twice, positioned himself behind a partially open bedroom door, where the shadows were deepest, and guided Max to a spot just beyond the living room couch. Max, 4 years old and powerfully built, lay with his head low and ears angled forward, black and tan coat, blending into the dark amber eyes fixed on the door. The dog's presence steadied Sarah in a way words could not. Michael trusted Max more than any plan. He had learned years ago in another winter that instincts were often the truest alarm. He kept his gloves on, breath-measured beard shadowing a jaw set by long practice at waiting. Outside, the storm did its work, masking sounds, encouraging confidence in those who believed weather could hide intentions. Time stretched. Sarah forced herself to read a magazine she did not see, to breathe evenly, to stand and move as if alone. Her mind wandered to the night at the diner, to the moment kindness had crossed into consequence. She wondered if courage always felt like this, cold and heavy and irreversible. Then Max's body tightened, not a bark, a vibration deep and warning. Michael's eyes lifted. Somewhere beyond the walls, footsteps scuffed against the stairwell, cautious, now purposeful. A metal scrape whispered at the doorframe. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. The lock resisted, then gave with a sharp crack that sounded too loud even in the storm. The door swung inward. Cold air flooded the room, carrying snow and the smell of wet wool. 3 men stepped inside, silhouettes first, then faces as they crossed the threshold. They were dressed for speed, dark jackets, gloves, hoods pulled low. One was tall and narrow, early 30s, sharp nose and restless eyes. Another was broader, mid-30s jaw, heavy mouth, set in a thin line that suggested impatience rather than fear. The third lingered near the door, scanning posture, rigid hands close to his pockets. None of them spoke at first. Sarah stood frozen near the couch, heart hammering every instinct, screaming to run, though she knew there was nowhere to go. The broad man smiled, a practiced curve that never reached his eyes. "You should have left town," he said, voice casual, almost bored. He took a step toward her. That was when Max rose. The sound that tore from the dog's chest was not loud, but it was unmistakable, low, thunderous, a promise rather than a threat. Max placed himself between Sarah and the men muscles, coiled teeth bared just enough to communicate certainty. The men hesitated, recalculating. In that heartbeat of doubt, Michael moved. He stepped from the bedroom shadows behind them, presence filling the space without haste. The light caught the lines of his face, the gray at his beard, the scars on his knuckles. He did not raise his voice. "That's far enough," he said. The narrow man spun, shock flashing across his features. The one by the door cursed under his breath and reached instinctively for something beneath his jacket. Michael's eyes hardened. "Don't," he said, and the word landed with weight. The apartment erupted into motion. Max lunged forward a single step, stopping short at Michael's subtle signal, a living wall that forced distance. The broad man stumbled back, colliding with a chair. The narrow one bolted for the hallway, slipping on tracked snow, crashing into the frame. Michael moved with economy, intercepting, twisting an arm just enough to disarm, without unnecessary damage. The third man bolted out the door, vanishing into the storm. Sarah screamed, the sound ripped from her despite herself, and then sirens cut through the night, sudden and close. Red and blue light flashed across the snow as police cruisers slid to a stop outside. Officers poured into the building, weapons drawn, voices sharp and controlled. One of them, Officer Daniel Reed, late 40s, with a square face and tired eyes that Miss Little took in the scene quickly. He had the look of a man who had spent years cleaning up after messes made quietly. He separated the men, cuffed the 2 still inside, and took Sarah's statement with professional calm, offering her a blanket when he noticed her shaking. Michael gave his name, nothing more, standing off to the side, with Max seated at his heel, the dog's focus unbroken. As the storm swallowed the last of the fleeing footsteps, Officer Reed exchanged a look with another officer and nodded. "This isn't small," he said quietly to Michael. "Not the first call we've had like this." Michael met his gaze, understanding, passing between them without elaboration. Sarah listened, stunned, as fragments surfaced, other reports, other threats, a pattern larger than her apartment, and her fear. The men were led away, their confidence gone, faces tight with the realization that the shadows had turned against them. When the door finally closed, and the lights dimmed, Sarah sagged against the wall, the adrenaline draining from her limbs. Michael crossed the room and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Max leaned into her leg, warmth and solidity grounding her in the aftermath. The plan had worked, but the cost pressed heavy. Sarah understood now that the danger had never been only about her. It had been about control, about silence enforced through fear. And tonight something had cracked. Outside, the storm continued, but beneath it, an unseen structure had begun to collapse. Late winter softened Wyoming's edges, snow thinning into slush beneath a pale sky, while sunlight lingered a little longer over the small town that had learned how to listen again. Months had passed since the night the door broke and the storm rushed in, and Sarah Miller could feel the difference in her body before she saw it in the streets. At 28, she still looked tall, and slim chestnut hair, now worn loose more often than tied back, pale skin carrying color again as fear loosened its grip. She no longer moved through rooms as if apologizing for her presence. People noticed her now, not because she sought attention, but because she no longer shrank from it. The investigation that followed the arrests had pulled at threads long ignored, and once tugged the weave unraveled quickly. Shop owners spoke to Officer Daniel Reed with trembling voices that grew steadier each day. Contractors admitted to payments they had called fees. Neighbors described threats disguised as favors. Truth spread quietly at first, then with momentum, until silence itself became suspect. Sarah gave her statement twice, hands, steady eyes, clear describing the diner, the glass, the footsteps, the door. Each retelling cost her something, but it also returned something she hadn't known she had lost. Michael Hayes watched the town change from the margins, as was his habit. He was still 45, still wearing the same dark brown leather jacket softened by years of cold, the red and navy flannel beneath it, the gray wool scarf, when the mornings bit. His beard remained short and rough gray threading through it like evidence he didn't bother to hide. But the way people looked at him had shifted. He was no longer just the quiet man who passed through and left no trace. He spoke with Officer Reed when asked, offering facts without embellishment, declining credit, with the same restraint he applied to everything else. The winter years that had shaped him still lived behind his eyes, the memory of a night when waiting had mattered more than rushing, when standing firm had meant the difference between loss and survival. He did not tell that story, but it informed every choice he made now, including the one to stay long enough to see the town breathe on its own again. Max never left his side. The 4-year-old German Shepherd had filled out even more with the passing month's broad chest powerful beneath a glossy black and tan coat, amber eyes, steady ears, alert but relaxed. He walked with the confidence of a dog who knew his purpose without needing instruction. Children learned quickly to ask before approaching, and Max accepted their careful hands with patient dignity. He slept lightly, rose quickly, and positioned himself instinctively between Michael and whatever demanded attention. To Sarah, Max became a presence as reassuring as a locked door and a lit room, a reminder that protection did not always need explanation. Sarah did not return to the diner full-time. The owner, a woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders, offered her flexible hours and gratitude that was both sincere and quiet. But Sarah found herself doing more than serving coffee. She helped Officer Reed connect with others who were afraid to speak, stood beside neighbors, when they finally decided to tell what they knew, and learned how to listen without flinching. The town responded in small ways. At first, a free meal slid across a counter. A nod held a second longer, a door opened without hesitation. Courage, she realized, was contagious when given room to breathe. Michael and Sarah spoke less often as the weeks passed, not from distance but from trust. When they did talk, it was with an ease that surprised them both. Sarah learned that Michael had not intended to stay, that his life had been a series of roads and winters since the night that shaped him. Michael learned that Sarah had grown up believing safety was something other people inherited. Neither tried to define what they were to each other. They did not need to. Max bridged the space easily, moving between them with the same certainty he brought to every threshold. By early spring, the cases closed and the noise faded. The town settled into a quieter honesty, bruised but intact. On an afternoon when snow fell lightly, more memory than threat, Michael parked across from the old diner. He did not go in. He stood outside instead, hands in his jacket pockets, boots planted on thawing ground. Max sat beside him, tail curled, close breath visible in the cooling air. Sarah arrived without surprise, her stride confident, her eyes meeting Michael's without hesitation. They stood together, watching steam rise from mugs inside, watching strangers become neighbors again. Michael broke the silence first. 5 words, he said, almost to the falling snow. Sarah nodded. She remembered how they had tasted like fear and truth at once, how they had demanded action without promise. She understood now that speaking them had been the beginning, not the end. Michael looked at the diner's glowing windows, then down at Max, who gazed back with uncomplicated loyalty. He thought of roads still waiting, of winters that would come again. He also thought of this place, and of a woman who had chosen not to turn away. They did not shake hands. They did not make vows. They stood, and that was enough. Snow dusted Max's fur, melting slowly. Michael adjusted his scarf, feeling the familiar weight of his jacket settle around him like an old decision. Sarah breathed in the cold air and felt no urge to look over her shoulder. Somewhere behind them, the town moved forward on its own feet. In front of them, the diner lights held steady against the dusk. 5 whispered words had changed everything, not because they banished fear, but because they refused to let it decide what came next. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come as a quiet warning, a trembling voice, or a moment when God places a choice directly in our hands. Fear tells us to stay silent. Faith asks us to speak. In this story, nothing changed because the danger disappeared. Everything changed because someone refused to turn away. That is how God often works in everyday life, not by removing the storm, but by giving ordinary people the courage to stand inside it and do what is right. In our own lives, we face smaller versions of the same test every day, when we see injustice, when someone needs help, when silence feels safer than truth. The miracle begins the moment we choose courage over comfort. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and redemption. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you when your moment to speak arrives.